Hey everybody, this is my 2022 personal year in review. I hope to do like a US slash current event slash world view year in review like in about a week. If you don't know me personally and you don't really care about what happened to me this year, just skip ahead to the next episode or go back and listen to some old episodes or whatever. It don't matter. But if you're not familiar with this show and you haven't listened to it from the beginning, my podcast was inspired by the fact that I started journaling at the end of the year 2020, around the new year, January 2021. And I've been journaling every day since then for 2 years now, and it's completely changed my life and the way that I live each day. And this podcast is a bit of a byproduct of that journal. But to understand how I got here, we have to go back to the year 2020. Probably the most awful year in modern human history, at least in my lifetime. Of course, you have those outliers who say things like, 2020 was a great year for me. I got married, earned my PhD, bought a house, and had 5 children. It was amazing.
Oh yeah? Well, congratulations. It wasn't so great for the rest of us.
But I'm not bitter. If we go back and remember what 2020 was like, social media had exploded that year with a bunch of political debates, images of rioting in the streets, and people spewing their vitriol over topics like mask mandates and government lockdowns. I shut down my social media accounts at the time in response to all of that hatred and stupidity. And in addition to the mandatory lockdowns, I just found myself drifting further and further away from society. And honestly, even now in late 2022, I still haven't completely recovered from that feeling, from that sentiment. I used to be an extremely social person, but 2022 was very much a year of voluntary isolation on my part. At the beginning of this year, I created a podcast episode called The Rainbow Connection, where I talked about how the pandemic forced me to realize that I wasn't really happy with the community that I built around me. With a few exceptions, it wasn't one that I wished to be part of anymore. I had a handful of very good friends at the time, but otherwise, I found myself feeling like I was in a very unhealthy environment. And when I started a journal during the pandemic, it forced me to come to terms with that. And so I started changing everything in my life. And that brings us to the year 2022. Basically, I decided to reset the matrix, to see what another completely different version of reality had to offer. And after sticking around long enough to be part of 2 weddings, I left the city of Cleveland behind, and I moved to a beach town on the Atlantic coast of Florida at the beginning of the year 2022. As late as December of 2021, I still didn't even know where I was going to move yet. I headed down to Denver, a small town outside of Austin, Tampa, Phoenix, and possibly Boise. I remember literally flipping a coin in the parking lot outside of work one day and saying, if it's heads, Tampa, and if it's tails, Arizona. Kind of sounds like that song.
Heads, Carolina, tails, California.
But I didn't do it because I was going to allow chance to make a decision for me, but because I wanted to see what my reaction would be to the result of the coin flip. It didn't matter because I didn't end up in any of those places. So ultimately, I suppose I actually did let fate decide, because I just went to the place where somebody offered me work, and I ended up at Florida's First Coast. As soon as I got the job offer, I packed up my things and I drove south. And I ended up in a place where Ponce de Leon first landed in the United States, which is pretty cool. I didn't know that before I got down here. It was not an easy move. On the week that I left, it snowed like crazy, so it pushed the move back for at least a day. And I was forced to go to my storage unit and dig it out from a 2 or 3 foot snow drift before I could get in to get my stuff. And in addition to that, on the day that I left, just minutes before I got ready to drive off, I couldn't find my cell phone. To this day, I really don't understand what happened. It just seemed to vanish into thin air. I had to go back and search for it for hours. And then I just finally gave up. It was horrible. Like, where did it go? Is this like some kind of sign? It put me so far behind, and the thought of traveling 1,000 miles without a map, like on Google Maps or whatever, and the inability to just call somebody along the way if something went wrong was just kind of terrifying. But I wasn't going to let anything stop me, and I wasn't going to wait around another day to figure this out. So I just got in my vehicle and I started driving south. Hours later, I just kind of came to terms with the fact that it was gone forever. So I stopped somewhere in West Virginia and bought the cheapest replacement phone that I could find, kind of thinking that maybe the old one would pop up at some time somewhere in some random place. But it never did. What an ominous start to the journey, right? I intentionally didn't research where I was moving to ahead of time because I wanted it to be an adventure when I arrived. And it was. I quickly found my way out into the wilderness because I love nature, and I saw a bald eagle and some ospreys and some herons and egrets, white ibises, muscovy ducks, some birds that I eventually found out were pelicans, and my favorite new bird of all, Anhingas. They are so weird. That's why I like them. And then there's sea creatures. I remember going on what they call an urban hike with a social group in downtown Jacksonville, looking out in the river. And as I was talking to a guy, I looked beyond him and I saw a fin in the water. And I was like, oh, wow, it's a shark. And he laughed and he said, it's probably a dolphin. And he was right. I was surprised to see a dolphin in the river in downtown Jacksonville, but I later found out that, yeah, they actually swim upriver. And that wasn't the only time I freaked out because I thought I saw a shark and it turned out to be a dolphin. But that's a different story for another day. There's this place where I go where there's like thousands of these little creatures called fiddler crabs. And I go out there and I kind of chase them and they all run away, like 100 of them at a time. And it makes me feel like Godzilla. But I'm really careful not to step on them. It's just fun to watch them run. One of my favorite animals here are armadillos. I didn't realize that they lived in Florida. I always thought of them as a Texas animal. And I was surprised to see that they were kind of cute. Almost like a cat or a pet, you know? I tried petting one of them in the wild recently and I realized that I was just petting a shell. And it couldn't feel me petting its shell, so I reached up and I petted its ears instead and it just ran away. But they're a lot more friendly than I thought they'd be. There are a lot of gopher tortoises here too. But then there's that big animal that I was not looking forward to meeting. I jumped online and I asked, what do I do if I see an alligator? And somebody said, don't worry, I lived here for 7 years and I still have yet to see one. And I'm like, oh yeah, well I've been here for 2 months and I've seen 2 already. Other people probably don't hang out at nature preserves as much as I do. But at first I could have cared less to see one. I would just rather not. I spent the first few months that I lived here just kind of being really paranoid about any time I was close to water. When I first got here, it was flooded and I was out in the nature preserve and I had to walk through flooded water. And I'm like, oh no, there might be an alligator in here. But then one day I was walking through the nature preserve and there it was on the other side of a fence. An alligator was staring at me. And I'm pretty sure he thought I looked delicious. I took a photo and I just got out of there as quickly as possible. I was so glad that there was that fence in between us because I was just terrified of them at the time. Since then, I've seen gators around probably a dozen times at least. And when a friend of mine came to town to visit recently, she specifically asked if we could go see them. So I took her to where I knew they were, and I told her I'm not promising anything. They may or may not be there, but they were. So I guess I've gotten used to them enough where I was willing enough to show them to people. One of my family members came to visit me, and her mother specifically told her, whatever you do, don't let him take you to see the alligators. But I learned that they're pretty lazy. They aren't nearly as aggressive as I ever thought they would be. And they're not really even interested unless they're trying to protect their eggs or their nest or whatever. They'd rather just avoid us in the same way that I'd rather avoid them. On one recent occasion, there was a huge alligator just sitting on the trail. And it was a thin trail with water on each side. And there was no other way to get around. And I watched several people just kind of casually walk around it within 10 or 15 feet of it. And since I really didn't have another option, I did it as well. But in my opinion, that was way too close for comfort. There are palm trees here and these smaller, shorter versions of palm trees called palmettos. And something that I didn't expect to see here were just like a lot of pines and this huge flourishing timber industry. You see that more inland, closer to Gainesville. I visited some interesting places since I moved here, although fuel skyrocketed in price as soon as I got down here. It was up to like $5 per gallon at one point, which kind of made it difficult to travel. My first big trip was to Savannah, Georgia. I just got in my vehicle and pointed to a point in the map and just went there. Didn't really plan it out very well. It was an extremely hot day that day, and I just really didn't enjoy the trip. But I ended up going back with a friend when it was cooler out, and I really had a blast that second time. It's an incredibly beautiful city, and it just goes on forever. The streets are lined with these southern live oak trees, and then there's this stuff called Spanish moss, which hangs from those branches. It almost looks like tinsel from a Christmas tree. It's really magical, and it makes you feel like you're traveling through a tunnel as you drive down the street, or maybe even like being on another planet. It's otherworldly. Also, on that second trip, I traveled to Tybee Island as well. I went to a Florida Gators game, and I am not a Gators fan. And it became evident as soon as I arrived that I really hadn't forgiven them for beating Ohio State in the national championship back in 2006, 2007. So I cheered for the opponent, the South Florida Bulls. But I did think that the University of Florida's traditions were pretty interesting. The fans in the stadium would all put their hands out like an alligator chomping its teeth down. Tens of thousands of them all at once. And probably the most memorable thing that they did, and I love college traditions, was at the end of the third quarter, they played Tom Petty's song, I Won't Back Down. When they got to the part where they go, hey, baby. It just kind of gave me chills because it was so powerful. It was a night game, and thousands of people had downloaded an app on their phones that made their flashlights blink in unison. It was a fun tradition, and just the sound of tens of thousands of people singing that part of the song all at once just was very, very cool. I thought it was a fun tradition, so when I got home, I looked it up. Apparently, Tom Petty is actually from Gainesville, and the tradition of singing his song after the third quarter began as a tribute to him shortly after he died, like the game after he died. And people enjoyed doing that so much that it just kind of became their tradition to do it every game at the end of the third quarter. So I thought that was pretty awesome. I went to my first ever NASCAR race at the Daytona Motor Speedway. It was called the Coke Zero 400. It was the one halfway through the season, not the Daytona 500. Austin Dillon won the race. Every time that I tell somebody that I went to a NASCAR race, they inevitably ask, do you actually like NASCAR? And I quickly have to explain that I like Daytona because it's restrictor plate racing, which I have no understanding of what that actually means. But ultimately, it prevents race cars from going too fast so that they don't get out of control, which mostly keeps them in a pack close together. And the result is closer finishes and lots of crashes in the meantime. So yes, I think NASCAR is okay, but I really enjoy Daytona. And I think the other race who does that is Talladega. And since I now live so close to my favorite track, how could I not go? But there were several rain delays, and I had to drive down there twice. And I had to pay for fuel twice, and I had to pay for parking twice because they never actually raced on the day that it was originally scheduled. Fortunately, I don't live that far away, so while it was very annoying and a bit expensive, it wasn't the end of the world for me. Seriously though, rain delays are the number one reason why I don't watch more NASCAR. Even when I want to watch it on TV, there's nothing more annoying than rushing home to watch a race just to have it delayed or just completely canceled because of rain. While I was waiting at a crosswalk to get into the speedway, I looked down and I noticed that I was standing at an anthill. Not just any anthill, fire ants. And dozens of them were crawling all over my legs, biting me. And those bites just kind of lasted for weeks. It was so annoying. It wasn't even that painful. It was just annoying for a long time. Like a mosquito bite that lasts for 3 weeks. I had some serious issues with StubHub and Ticketmaster this year. I really haven't gone to a lot of big events in recent years, but since I'm in a new place, I saw going to stadiums as a chance to explore. And after going to a few of these events, I realized a couple of things. It isn't worth it to me. Dealing with these horrible ticket companies and their crappy apps that just don't work. Why can't I just get an old school paper ticket so that I don't have to deal with these awful apps that don't work when you arrive? It really ruins the fun to have to deal with it. When I went to that Gators game, I didn't actually get into the stadium until halfway through the first quarter because of it. And if there hadn't been a rain delay at the NASCAR race, I would have been late for it too. The Jacksonville Naval Air Station Air Show was totally free, but I had to wait in 2 hours of traffic to get there. And then I had to wait 2 hours to get out in traffic. It was brutal, but it was worth it to be there. I've never been so up close and in person at an air show before, and it was absolutely incredible. I walked away from that thinking about how those people in those airplanes are just kind of made of different stuff than the rest of us are. Also, I learned that the Blue Angels were actually born out of the Jacksonville Air Station. So it was a really special treat to see them up close and in person in the place where they were actually created. I'd seen them before in Cleveland a few times, but never so close. They never disappoint. I also explored the city of St. Augustine, which is the oldest city in the United States, I learned. And I've been there several times. It's a very cool place with interesting little shops, an old fort, a drawbridge, really eclectic people, old Spanish-style architecture. And there's like sailboats everywhere on the river. It's a very, very unique city. I kind of experienced my first hurricane ever. And it was a big one, although I was on the East Coast and it struck the west coast of Florida the hardest. Hurricane Ian. But it wasn't too bad for me personally. I basically had 3.5 paid days off of work and I basically just napped and drank the entire time, peeking outside every once in a while to see what it looked like. It wasn't too terribly awful by the time I got to where I live, but I definitely wouldn't have wanted to be out there in it. Still, it was this very unique, quiet feeling. I'm not sure how to explain it. It was different than anything I ever experienced before. Probably the closest thing I could compare it to would be like a huge snowstorm where you just have to hunker down for a few days. The power went out several times. So when that happened, I turned off my cell phone and attempted to save the power, and I tried to eat only non-perishable foods that I had purchased a few days before so that I could make sure that I kept the refrigerator doors closed so the food inside didn't go bad. But even here, the power outages didn't last too long. I finally understand how people get caught up in these bad situations when hurricanes approach. They are very unpredictable. And just 100 miles difference in its trajectory could be the difference between having to evacuate and just kind of sticking it out. And the trajectory can change really fast. Traveling will cost you hundreds of dollars, and if you don't need to spend it, then why would you? So you kind of want to wait until the last minute to make the decision. But sometimes it's too late by the time you realize it's coming at you. I remember going to the liquor store the night before things got really bad because, I needed some booze if I'm going to hunker down for 3 days. And I think I recorded a couple of podcast episodes over that time. And the clerk there at the store said, "We basically live on an island. If the wind gets above 50 miles per hour, they're going to shut down the bridges and there's no getting off the island anymore." It had never occurred to me that I live on an island before. But surely enough, I thought about it and I realized that there is no way of leaving the beach town that I live in without crossing a huge bridge.
Uh-oh.
I hope I'm prepared. I really hadn't thought this through. I didn't know what I didn't know, And let's not forget about one of my favorite things to do, which I've already talked about on other episodes, and that is to watch rocket launches. I won't spend a lot of time on this since I did an entire episode about it, maybe 2. But basically, I learned that watching a launch from the Kennedy Space Center wasn't really worth the money. And I learned that I can just watch them from home. So I've spent many, many of my evenings on the beach just watching rocket launches from 100 miles away or so. I love it. There have been so many big space events this year, too. They didn't all launch this year, but they happened this year, which makes it really even more exciting to live this close to all the action. I kind of got to watch the Artemis 1 launch, the one that went to the moon from my local beach, although it was a little cloudy and it was more like seeing a little piece of it instead of the whole launch. And let's talk about the beach. I love the beach. I love living by the ocean. I try to go there at least once a week, at least I do when it's warmer. And I thought I'd get tired of it, but I really don't. I never get tired of it. I bought a boogie board so that I can enjoy it more. It makes it a lot more fun to go into the water, but I'm not particularly good at using it. Still, like I said, it's a lot of fun. In 2023, I'm actually going to try surfing. Like, boogie boarding is like wimpy surfing. I'm going to do the real thing in 2023.
Dude, I never thought I'd be a surfer.
I'm going to be. I'm going to try it.
Bitchin', dude.
A couple of people came to visit me from Ohio, one of my family members, and I took her to St. Augustine and Jacksonville Beach. And we explored those beach towns, but she was only in town for a few hours. An old friend of mine came to visit too, and we had this big, long, entire weekend to explore, so I ran her ragged with exploring as much as possible. We drove to Savannah and Tybee Island on the first day, and she was exhausted by the end of the day. So on the next day, I realized that there needed to be more relaxation and downtime and less exploration, if that makes sense. I've talked about this in other episodes where I run too hard on vacation. But this wasn't my vacation, it was hers, so I decided to adjust for her, if that makes sense. When people come to visit me, I say, listen, I can do this anytime. I live here. So you tell me what you want to do. And if we don't see something that I want to see, I can just go there anytime. So this is all about you. So on day 2, I took her to St. Augustine. And on day 3, we just kind of were lazy and we watched football. And then I took her to the nature preserve to see the alligators. We had a great time, though. And since I've moved to Florida, I went back to Ohio to see family once. But I realized it's really expensive to travel 1,000 miles these days. So I don't get to go back to see them as much as I would like to. I wasn't sure what my new life in Florida would be like, but I mostly remained isolated here, somewhat intentionally, I guess. On Thanksgiving Day, I started to miss my family, so I restarted my social media account for the first time in over 2 years, and I'm cautiously hesitant to dive back in head first. And I'm sure that I'll have to shut it back down in 2024 when the world goes crazy again due to politics, but in the meantime, we'll see how it goes. And similarly, I'm just kind of reluctant to get too close to people here, even the ones that I like the most. I don't plan to be in Florida for 2024, but we'll see. Anything can happen. Plans change. And making new friendships just to lose them is a hard thing to do, especially when you do it over and over and over again. I'll never forget the looks of those close friends that I once had when I tell them that I'm leaving town. And it's rarely the people that I expect to be upset about me leaving who seem the most upset when I go. When I made new friends in my last years in Cleveland, I told them from day one that I wouldn't be around for very long. Some of them, I think, almost didn't believe me. When I left, one person said, "You are exactly who you said you were," which I think she meant as a mean thing to say. But I just kind of feel like that's a good quality, to be honest, and forthright about my intentions. But I don't know. I am a nomad by nature, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. And I'm always ready to move on to the next adventure. And when I think about leaving Florida and how happy I am here, it just kind of makes me sad. I love it here. And mostly I found great peace and happiness. Not having to deal with cold rain and snow and freezing temperatures and gloomy skies for 7 months a year has just been really amazing. And I'm honestly a little afraid to leave it behind. I've been far more mentally healthy this year, and I lost another 8 pounds at one point, in addition to the previous year's 32. But then, of course, I gained 5 of those pounds back when football season started.
Sitting around eating too many nachos and drinking too much beer.
But still, I am way better off than I was 2 years ago, physically and mentally, back when I first started my journal. I'm living this huge adventure, at least for now, and I'm loving every minute of it. As I said in my 2021 year in review, I had to start living the kind of life that was worthy of journaling about. And while what I'm doing is not perfect, I'm doing a lot better than I used to. I don't know. I hope I'm living right. Anyways, that was my own personal 2022 year in review. I hope I didn't miss anything important. If I did, I'll just put an update right here. Oh, one thing that I forgot was that I visited Stone Mountain State Park in North Carolina on my way back from Ohio, when I visited Ohio. And that was really cool. It was really great trails, really great hiking, really cool scenic overlooks. It wasn't too far out of the way. And I forgot to talk about Hurricane Nicole, which also came through, which wasn't nearly as bad as Ian, but since it wasn't as bad, I was actually able to go out and look over the ocean and see the storm surge come in, and we got soaked. If the rain coming down wasn't bad enough, the huge surges of water from the ocean came up and pretty much destroyed us. So that was fun too. I walked back home very wet. Anyways, I think this is coming out on either Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, and so I want to wish everybody Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Thanks for listening to the show. The Great Big Intergalactic can be heard on Spreaker, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, Apple iTunes, and anywhere else that podcasts can be heard. If social media is your thing, you can follow the program on Facebook or Twitter. If you enjoy the show, upvote, share, like, and subscribe. Whenever and wherever those things can be done. If you'd like to send feedback, the easiest way to do that is to email the show at tgbiuniverse@gmail.com, TGBI as in the Great Big Intergalactic, or you can leave a voicemail at 216-200-7940. Contributions could include written feedback, audio submissions, voicemails, or potentially even live guests. It was great having you today, and see you next time.